Hi, everyone. Before we begin, we'd like to remind you of our very first ever live show on June 8th at the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London with some amazing guests. We will be announcing them early next week. Info on tickets are in the show notes. And now, on to our Passover episode. It's Pesach and Chol HaMoed, and we thought the right thing to do this week is to bring you some of our bits from our conversations of the past year and try to find some optimism in them, actually. But before we do all that, it is customary to ask, how was your Seder, Jonathan?
Well, when you say how was my Seder, of course we have two outside Israel. It is, not everyone. Obviously, lots of Reform Jews only do one, Progressive Jews. But we did two. And I have to say, they were very special, I think, this year. And I think a lot of people will say this. There were suggestions that there be a very particular focus on the hostages this year, that marking their second Pesach in captivity. There were suggestions about even altering the Seder plate. And, certainly at one of the two, at least, there was a lemon on the Seder plate, as suggested, the kind of sourness, the bitterness of that, plus yellow being the colour of the hostage freedom movement. And look, even without those prompts, there would have been discussion, of course there would, about the hostages and indeed about the whole of the last year, about the suffering on both sides. There's always a discussion about for the parting of the Red Sea, and there's in the Haggadah, there's this passage about whether or not you can celebrate the downfall of your enemies and the obligations to feel something for, even in that story, the Egyptians, as it were. And so there were discussions around, my Seder table about that too, about the anguish that those who are demanding freedom of feeling and even the anguish of those who are in the current conflict, Israel's enemies. So there was plenty to talk about. And I just think also a sense of kind of relief of people to be with family and with friends. So that was how Seder played out, in London. What about in Tel Aviv?
Well, obviously, a chair left for a hostage. That is become. It is unbelievable that we're talking about the second Seder after October 7th. So that has become somewhat of a tradition, I think, for many Israeli families. 59 hostages still in captivity. And I think one of the more painful things that we edited as a network was just images of those hostages with their families on Pesach Eve, before, obviously, they were abducted by Hamas. But, it is a tradition and a Jewish tradition that must continue. I assume you're the MC Seder. That is my assumption.
I can't imagine what you based it on and why you leaped to that conclusion. But yes, you're right. What about you, though? I'm guessing the same is true in your house.
The same. I asked my family for the standard rate for me to run this. I'm kidding. To run the Seder, but that's always, and it's a funny thing, your memories from this going on your whole life. And for so many years, I think until my older sister had children who could sing, I was the person who had to sing Manishtana which means well into my 20s.
Wow. I was imagining that at your Seder, the youngest asks the 4 questions, and then you go, no, I must press you on this. I'm looking for an answer to my questions. That you're anchoring the Seder. So you were still doing it into your 20s.
It's true.
Yeah, no, you've got to have a proper, authentically young person, I think. And it's a sign, it's a cue in a family. Come on, let's get on with it. We need a new generation when somebody in their 20s is singing the Manishtana. So the Seder, obviously hugely significant. But as you said, we are trying, and we've set the bar high, to find some light in these days of holiday. And our plan was really to bring together a few of the conversations we've had. And I think we've lined up a few really memorable conversations, all of which were people who did manage to bring something. I wouldn't say cheer necessarily, but some light and some hope.
So let's kick off with Rachel Maddow, who we talked to again this year, right after her book came out. The book is titled Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism. It sort of is her two podcast seasons, ultra, all in one book. Optimism this year is a complicated thing, but what she was trying to remind us in that conversation was that fascism lost. And I think that was sort of the underlining notion of that conversation. So let's hear a little bit of that.
The reason I wrote the book actually started from a contemporaneous question. In 2017, when Trump and Trumpism sort of overtook the Republican Party, and then when he was elected, it was not surprising to see the radical restructuring of the Republican Party, sort of ideological resorting of what it meant to be a mainstream Republican. I also think it wasn't surprising to see the far right celebrate Trump and his rise. What was surprising to me was this big spike in something that I think of as existing outside those sort of electoral politics contours. And it was a big spike in Holocaust denial, which I think of as a very fringe thing, at least particularly in 2017, I thought of as a very fringe thing. And to me, it was as a correlation, I just didn't understand why they seemed to be rising in concert and why some of the worst people and the very farthest, not just right-wing fringes, but anti-Semitic and Holocaust-denying fringes of the American beyond the pale extremist edge, we're also celebrating this moment on the American electoral right. And so what I wanted to do was figure out the origins of American Holocaust denial. And I started working on that and was surprised to find that it existed even in the 1940s, which if you think of Holocaust denial as a factually irrational thing, it's hard enough to grasp it now in the 2020s, but in the 1940s, while the ashes of Europe weren't yet cool, that was a strange time to already be denying that it was happening. And so I started to, once I think you can firmly dislocate the idea of Holocaust denial from any misapprehension of the facts, from any potentially good faith misunderstanding of what happened, and you start to realize it as a purely political thing, you can see why it was happening the way it was in 2017, and it led me to the story of what happened to that class of Americans in the 40s. And we had a big domestic fight against a very powerful, very well-connected pro-fascist, pro-Nazi movement in the United States in the 1940s. And that is good to know as our history. It's good to remember that we have had a recurring fight against movements like this in our country. And I think it's important to learn now because that side lost, broadly speaking, in the 1940s in the United States. And I think it's helpful for those of us who think of ourselves as anti-fascists today to know what tactics were effective against our forebears who were a similar kind of movement, I think, in the lead up to World War II. You know, for me, thinking about this just tactically and strategically in terms of Americans who are trying to, and actually people around the world who are trying to resist and fight and ultimately defeat this rising tide of authoritarianism that so many countries are dealing with right now, it functions at a couple of different levels. I mean, one is that, you know, by diagnosing why the surprisingly large fascist movement in the United States in 1940 didn't succeed is to understand what were its strengths and weaknesses. And that helps us identify strengths and weaknesses today. I do think, for example, tactically today, it's really important to recognize that we've never before had an authoritarian-minded movement that both had an effective, charismatic, single leader and was linked to, and in fact, deeply ingrained in mainstream electoral politics. We've never had all of those things at once. We've had a Huey Long character. We've had a silver shirts, paramilitary, pro-fascist, pro-Nazi militia. We've had Charles Lindbergh leading the America First Committee, and we've had members of Congress affiliated with those things. But all of those elements coming together, we haven't seen before. That, I think, it's strategically disambiguating to recognize what we've had before and what we haven't. But I'd also say tactically, you have to think about the appeal of the authoritarian message. Why do people like it? Why do people fall for it? Why do people want a strongman form of government rather than a small d democratic form of government? And to me, I find it tactically helpful to know that the message is always exactly the same. It's the same thing every decade, every generation, every country. They are always selling the same thing. And once you realize that it's a rerun, and that, sometimes it's an Italian accent, sometimes it's in a German accent, sometimes it has a Queen's accent, I think knowing that this is a shtick is helpful to me in terms of taking away some of its power. What's exciting about the strongman form of government is it's always sold as something brand new. All the old systems don't work. We've got to do something new and efficient. Well, this isn't a new idea. This is an old, inefficient, and failed idea that you're trying to dress up and sell again to a new generation.
So Rachel Maddow's series, Ultra, really is excellent. It's a must-listen to series of it. But both, as you said, Yoni, bring out that point that, in a way, even when things got very, very dark in the United States, the country did come out of it. And I have found myself clinging to that thought recently. Similarly, a conversation we had with Van Jones, the former Obama administration official, CNN commentator, who is really insightful on the Black-Jewish relationship and how that has obviously been a point over decades of strain. But there is also a history of cooperation, of alliance, of comradeship. And what Van Jones spoke to us about was how he had not given up on that and how he still thought there was a chance for that relationship to do productive, fruitful things in the future. When he and we spoke, it was still the Biden administration. We weren't speaking about the current reality. But I think there are nevertheless things in what he said which can point a way forward for the coming months.
Even in those glory days, those tough days of civil rights, the vast majority of Jewish people did not participate in the civil rights movement. That's just a fact. Also, the vast majority of Black people didn't participate either, because participating in the civil rights movement would get you killed. It would get you beat up. It would get you put in jail. So it was the Black-Jewish alliance was always a lot smaller than we remember. There was never a time all the Blacks and all the Jews. No, you always had some Black people didn't like Jewish people. You always had some Jewish people didn't like Black people. We all got some terrible uncles and some crazy cousins. But what you had, though, was that the best of the Black community and the best of the Jewish community stood together. The Black people who most believed in our cultural DNA of justice for all, and the Jewish people who most believed in the cultural DNA of repairing the world. The people who believed in that the most, for small numbers, got together and changed the world. And then we all get a chance to bask in the glory of that. But the reality is most people didn't. It was too scary and too dangerous. Most people didn't take part. But we hold on to that memory of the best of us holding on to each other. And the danger we have now is that the best of us may not hold on to each other. The best of us may not trust each other. The best of us may not know each other. And that's not just bad for Black people. That's not just bad for Jewish people. That's bad for everybody, because everybody reaped the benefit of that partnership. That Black-Jewish partnership, small though it was, changed the world. Those marches, those lawsuits, that courage, basically, we co-authored what we now call American democracy. It didn't exist. 1909, when a Black-Jewish alliance was created, that Black-Jewish alliance was called the NAACP. People don't understand. Jewish people were not considered white. They were considered colored. So the NAACP was a Black-Jewish alliance. The next year, 1910, you had another Black-Jewish alliance, which we now call the Urban League. So the two longest, strongest, proudest civil rights groups in the world were actually started off as Black-Jewish alliances. Nobody knows that. And so you have this long history. But what I don't think is good is for Jewish people who in their own personal life have done very little or nothing, except for maybe they march for 10 minutes for Black Lives Matter and put up something on their Instagram, to then tell that you should do this. We've done all this for you. Well, if you haven't personally done much, you might want to back off of that, because you might be talking to somebody who's having a much worse decade than you. You might be having a bad year, but you're talking to a Black person who's had a bad couple of decades. And so I caution that whole, we were for you, we were for you, we're for you. First of all, not that many of you were for us, and you probably aren't, and that's not a good way to start a conversation. So we gotta keep this stuff in balance.
We should say that Van Jones, first of all, is one of the commentators who wore a yellow ribbon pin to raise awareness to the plight of the hostages held in Gaza from right after October 7th. I think what this sort of underscores is the need for allies from outside the Jewish community when you discuss things like anti-Semitism. And I think he really is a true ally of the Jewish community. And I think that was very consistent throughout our conversation with him earlier this year.
Our next conversation is one actually that you had, Yonit, alone. I was not there for this dialogue, but it's one that absolutely stays with me when you spoke with Aviva Sigal, who herself was a hostage. And when you spoke to her, I think she was in the last hours of waiting for the release of her husband. Keith, the interview was aired once he was free, but that sense of every second, every minute of captivity and how painful that is for the hostage, obviously, but for the family and their loved ones behind. And obviously Aviva able to see throughout that from both ends of the telescope, having been a hostage and being the spouse of a hostage. I found that a very, very huge weighted conversation. I spoke just before about the having somehow a thought, even in the Seder, the downfall of your enemies. Incredibly, in your interview with her, she talked about, as she herself was emerging from captivity, on the day of the handover for her, looking out and looking at Gaza and Gazans and Palestinians and feeling empathy for them. I know lots of listeners were really struck by that somebody who had been in the very depths of hell was able to feel that human empathy for a human being and for Palestinians in Gaza in the midst of war. But let's hear the conversation you had with Aviva Sigal.
I didn't know anything about maybe going back to Israel. I thought I'm just going to stay in Gaza forever, maybe. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very huge surprise for me when the Hamas terrorists came up to me and said, "You tomorrow, Israel." And it was like, I didn't believe what he said. And he had to say it again. And then I said, "What about Keith?" And he said, "No, only you." So I said, "I'm not going without Keith. I want to stay here with Keith, or Keith is coming with me." And I remember myself arguing with him and then realizing that I'm not allowed to argue with anybody because I just have to behave. My heart was just going on 2000 and even was sore at that moment. And for me to go to Keith, well, I wasn't allowed to because he said, "You're not going to Keith." I said that I'm going to Keith. I'm not going without going to say goodbye to Keith. And finding him looking sad. So I bent down to him and I said to him that he said that I'm going to Israel and that he must be strong for me and I'll be strong for him, because those words just came out and I feel so lucky that I said them because it has kept me going. I'm strong for Keith, and I'm sure that Keith is strong and keeping his strength to come back to his family, to me, and to his grandchildren and children. And it was very, very difficult at that moment because, first of all, I didn't know where I'm going to be taken to because I was alone. I was alone with Hamas terrorists for nearly 24 hours. Part of the time I was with a Thai guy that didn't talk to me, but it felt like I was alone with them, not knowing what's going to happen, where they're going to take me, and if it's going to happen. And it was very strange for me even to think about going back to Israel because I wasn't prepared. I was shocked. I didn't believe them. And the whole day, the next day, what we went through was just such a difficult day. What you saw on TV when they tried to break the windows of the car, whether we were in, of the Red Cross, I was sure that would be the end of my life. And everything was, very, very tense. Everybody was tense. They were tense. We were tense. And just going through the roads in Gaza was a tense feeling because some of the roads were blocked and some of them, they didn't know where to go through. They had to go around and around to find themselves getting out of Gaza. And all the, that mess that the Hamas did, and everybody there was just, it was like too much for me. But I do remember that when the Hamas terrorists put us in the car, there were two terrorists sitting in front and a couple of them sitting at the back while they took us to the Red Cross, and they put Arabic music and they put it on full volume and the windows were open. And the people from outside could see us. And I remember dancing. I couldn't sing because I didn't know the song, but I was dancing, sitting and dancing with with the music, with the Arab music, and all the terrorists were like looking at me and smiling. And I said to the girls that were with me, Ella and Daphna, sorry, I haven't heard music for 51 days. I just want to dance.
What a remarkable woman. Viva Siegel was held by Hamas 51 days. Her husband, Keith, came out only after 484 days. And as you said, we had this conversation with her on a Wednesday. The family was waiting for Keith's release on Thursday. It eventually happened 2 days later on Saturday. I think when you're waiting for something for such a long time, those extra 48 hours can feel like forever. But now they are both back with their families, and she is really, and they're both really just a unique pair. They continue to crisscross the globe to call for the release of the rest of the hostages who are still held in Gaza. Our next conversation is, for both of our lists, one of our favorites. We spoke to digital creator who's dubbed Nas Daily. His real name is Nuseir Yassin. He's an Arab Israeli from the northern part of Israel. He's an Arab Israeli. We spoke to him, and one of the things that he told us is, after October 7th, I'm first Israeli, and then second, I'm a Palestinian. And he went on to explain, his childhood and the way he feels about the country. But also, we talked about a lot of other things, and also in the sort of realm of social media, why Israel is portrayed in a certain way and Hamas in a certain way. I think he had a few really interesting insights to share with us.
For the longest time, I thought, okay, algorithm is just whatever's more interesting, people want to watch, and just like on the Palestinian side, the content is just more interesting and there's more volume. But then I saw a research that compared the percentage of posts on TikTok about Kashmir, India, Pakistan, the percentage of posts on TikTok about Kashmir versus the percentage of posts on Kashmir on Instagram. And there was clear evidence that people talk about Kashmir more on TikTok than on Instagram. And that blew my mind, because the percentages should be the same. Because let's say 10% talk about music on TikTok, 10% should talk about music on Instagram, 10% on YouTube, whatever. But there is a massive difference on specific issues like Taiwan, Kashmir, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, and Russia. And that's when I realized there is some real suppression happening here. And as much as I love TikTok as a platform, I think it's incredibly questionable, the algorithm. And if I was China, I would do the same. I think for the last 25 years, we've had one internet. Hey, go to the internet. Okay, everybody has the same internet. But actually, in the next 25 years, I think we're going to have 100 internets. Hey, go to the internet. Which internet? India internet or China internet or America internet or Israel internet? In the Israel internet, there is no Al Jazeera. In the India internet, there is no TikTok. In the China internet, there's no social media at all. So I think you're going to see more fragmentation, which means TikTok will for sure be banned in many more countries, and you will just have the China internet and the America internet fighting for each other. And it's just which internet you wanna belong to.
So in terms of the country and the environment you grew up in, because I'm very aware that you studied at Harvard, you are this completely sort of international figure now, this huge following all over the world. I think you're based in Dubai, if that's right, and now. But in terms of the upbringing you had, because this is a perspective, I'm not sure how often people hear this about people, Palestinians or Arabs who grew up in Israel. I think you've said somewhere that you didn't really know Jewish people until you got to America, even though you lived in a country that is 80% Jewish. I mean, just tell us about what that is like to be a Palestinian in Israel, especially one who, regards his country, as you've told us at the beginning, as being Israel, because you're a citizen of Israel. And it's it's the land of your birth.
Yeah, I'll tell you, my childhood is ridiculous. My childhood is shameful, for lack of a better word. And the reason it was shameful is because I spent 20 years in Israel and I had 0 Jewish friends. My parents lived 65 years in Israel and they have not been invited to a Shabbat once. Once. Now that is crazy to think about, right? And all my Israeli friends have 0 Arab friends. It is literally shocking that I grew up not hating Israel and Jews. I would go to a bar in Tel Aviv and I would have no way I would hit on any girl because a Jewish girl would never talk to an Arab guy, right? So in a way, it's like I felt the inferiority growing up. I felt like a second-class citizen. And I'm not here to blame anyone or anything. I'm just telling you that's how I felt. And it was because of the system, but also because of my culture. I think both things just did not want to mix. The culture of Arabs is more on the, take the back seat. I don't want to participate in Israel. And the culture of Israel is, I also don't want you to participate in my culture. And so we have two worlds in one country under one border, and that is freaking ridiculous. So if I was dictator for one day, what I would do in Israel is I would mix schools. I would force schools to mix. No more Arab-only school and Jewish-only school. Sure, Orthodox Jews can have their own school, whatever. But if you're not Orthodox Jewish, you're Arab or Jewish, Arabs or Jewish, that's secular, you're in the same school. And community service / army must be mandatory for everybody. If you're alive, you have to go to the army or do a community service, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, or whatever. Those two things, if you make those two things a reality in Israel, you get a much better upbringing for everybody involved.
There's a reason why Nas Daily's output goes viral around the world. It's just such a charismatic speaker, and a lot of people were fascinated by him and again thought, well, that maybe is what the future is going to look like. Somebody who's minded for, an entrepreneur who feels himself to be, yes, Palestinian, but yes, a citizen of Israel, and both. And bothness, we know, is a big Jewish trait. And he, a Palestinian Israeli, was exemplary of that, or exemplified that. We had long wanted on the podcast the comedian, writer, actor Alex Edelman, who is a sensation. He had a huge hit on Broadway. He won a Tony Award for his one-man show. It became an HBO special. We talked a lot about that. He's incredibly sort of Jewishly literate. He grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home in not New York, as a lot of people assume, but in Massachusetts. We talked about that too.
I grew up in a racist part of Boston called Boston is one of the lines from his HBO special, just for us.
He is very funny and very, very smart. Right towards the end of our conversation, because we spoke to him just in the week of Purim, and you shared with him your theory, Yonit, that Purim, despite being a Jewish festival, was not very Jewish, or in fact not Jewish. And he then, with some prompting, went into, okay, let's go through the Chagim, the festivals. Which one is Jewish? Which ones are not Jewish? With, to my mind anyway, some very surprising results.
There are a couple of non-Jewish holidays. First of all, I hate to say this, but Yom Kippur is not Jewish. Yom Kippur, it's this nakedly aspirational concept that you're going to get forgiveness from your family and friends, that a chapter is closed. Jews never close the chapter. Jews are constantly scribbling in the book of life, asking for more stuff. Rosh Hashanah is the most Jewish holiday, and Yom Kippur is the least Jewish. That's what I'll say. That Jewish New Year centered around death and forgiveness, that is on brand. But a holiday where your slate is wiped clean, you know your slate's not wiped clean. You know. Because your cousin said some shit to you, and you still are never forgiving him, right? We do forgiveness, but we don't do clean slates. Jews forgive, but they don't forget. That's the thing. Jews forgive, but it's shit we like to lord over you for a while, huh? Hanukkah's like conservadox, okay? Hanukkah is a conservadox holiday, and it's also a little nationalist, and people are really excited to highlight the nationalism, and they like get all high and mighty about Hanukkah, a thing they never cared about before October 7th. Now everyone's like, oh, Hanukkah's my favorite holiday, and I love to talk about the nationalist implications of Hanukkah, or the nationalist underpinnings, or the Zionist underpinnings. Everyone's so excited to do it. Tu B'Shvat's Jewish, but Tu B'Av is not. Tisha B'Av is Jewish, but Tanis Esther is not. Shavuot's not Jewish. That much dairy is not Jewish. A holiday where you have dairy? A milchik holiday? I'm sorry. A holiday where your family gives you the wrong type of kugel? I could. It's not right. Where you stay up all night. Excuse me. Jewish is 9 p.m. bedtime. Staying up all night is not Jewish. Pesach is crazy Jewish. I mean, excuse me. Here's every Seder. You get after everything after the meal is optional, and you know it because early bedtime is Jewish. And you start a Seder at like 3 p.m. and at 10 p.m. you're barely finished the meal, and you're like, all right, I'm tapping out. Not a single Jew has ever made it to Hallel. It's over. No one ever makes it to Hallel. Nerzah, forget about it. You know what you do? You halfway through the last course of the Pesach meal, you go, does anyone want to say next year in Jerusalem? And someone does, and you're like, let's pack it up. You've heard about the goat song. You've heard about Chad Gadya, but you don't really do it. Nobody really does it.
I think we can agree after the Seder that Pesach is crazy Jewish. I think that on that we can agree. I mean, I would just, if any of our listeners haven't heard the full conversation, I think just go back and listen to it, including, when we asked him, are his Jewish parents who are, his father's a doctor, his mother is a lawyer, are they disappointed he's not a lawyer or a doctor? His answer is also, I think, memorable. I was going to say, if we are on the issue of Judaism, yeah. A good friend of this podcast, Rabbi Angela Buckdahl, we turned to her to ask how, an essential Jewish question, perhaps, definitely after October 7th, how to be Jewish in this world, how to be, rise up after being hurt so badly, and what to do with that, how to live between the sort of sadness and the need to also be happy. And this is the answer that she gave us.
This question of, do we celebrate? How do we celebrate? I guess it's not a new question. In many ways, this is the question we've been asking ourselves since October 7th. I think about Itai Chen's family. He was taken into captivity, and they had their youngest son's bar mitzvah the next week. Do we celebrate? I think about Doron Peretz's family. They had one son, he was shot, and another one in captivity, and he had a wedding. And they had to decide, do we go forward with this wedding? Can we possibly celebrate? And I personally was officiating a very big wedding in Mexico City the Shabbat, after October 7th. And the family came to me and said, can we still do this wedding? And my response was, we absolutely must go forward with this wedding. And, there's a story from the Talmud, which I thought was illustrative. When you have a funeral procession and it bumps into a wedding procession, it's actually, they're commanded, the mourners, to take a few steps away from their mourning and actually celebrate with the bride and groom and then go back. And I find that sense that actually Jews, even in the face of death, will continue to choose life and life-affirming things like love and family and community. That's what we do. And I think we know that what Hamas wanted to do was not just murder Jews. On October 7th, the barbarity, the scale, the brutality, the degradation, they wanted to demoralize and break our spirit. And I think the act of choosing to celebrate is a form of spiritual resilience and resistance. And so, yes, I never understood better until October 7th how our tradition says, I set before you life and death, choose life. I always thought, well, of course you choose life. That's so obvious. And then I thought about what it's like when death is right before you and you think, how do I possibly choose life? And yet that is what Jews do. And that is what Itai Chen's family did. It's what the Peretz family did. It's what my wedding couple did. It's what Israelis have been doing all year as babies continue to be born, as weddings happen, as people are finding ways. We do have to properly grieve the things that have been very difficult. And that includes that we're going to make space for memory. Jews are a people of memory. We'll continue to do that. That we don't forget what happened here, that we don't forget the people that we lost. So we will do that. And in some ways, that proximity to death is not to leave us in that dark place, but that proximity is to actually bring us back to life and to kind of crack our hearts open and to help us actually empathize and connect with all others. I think one of the things that's that we forgot in some ways as American Jews, and I think Israelis also forgot it, is that the existential state of the Jew is to have nefesh hager, to have the soul of a stranger. Because, even from the very first Jew, from Abraham, he wasn't actually allowed to begin Judaism from his home, from his birthplace, from his native land. He actually has to cross over. And it's that crossing over that makes him an Ivri, like Ya'avor. He is a boundary crosser. And when he crosses over, that's when we become Hebrews, when we actually feel like we're a stranger. And that has been the Jewish story for 2,000 years while we were a diaspora people. But in some ways, once we had our land again in Israel, and once American Jews felt as comfortable as we felt here, we stopped in some ways remembering what it was like to be a stranger. And now nobody likes feeling like the stranger, but I would posit that it was in this time of feeling like the stranger, the Jews developed our sense of, creativity. We had to figure out a way to do things differently or a different route than others did. Our compassion and empathy for those who have been most vulnerable and oppressed. It is where we developed our grit in many ways and our cohesion as a community. So in so many ways, who we are as a people was forged in a place of feeling a little bit like we were on the outside. And maybe what this moment does is remind us of what that feeling was. And it's not to make us feel like isolated and outsiders. What it's supposed to make us feel is both bonded with our own tribe, but also to remember that means we reach out and empathize and we build bridges. This is what Jews have done throughout history. So I actually think there's an opportunity to connect with the essence of what it is to be a Jew in the world. And that is an opportunity for us. And to be a light, of course.
Well, like all the conversations we've picked, Yonit, the conversation we had with Rabbi Angela Buchdahl was one that I can always tell it prompted a whole series of WhatsApp messages, etc., to me, friends, family saying, wow, about her. Several people saying, well, if that was what my rabbi was like, I would go to synagogue more often. Got that from a few people. I do encourage people to go back to that conversation, if only to hear Rabbi Angela singing. She has a beautiful voice, but also contained in that music is some of the themes I think that we've been reaching for in this episode, which are the prospect of hope, even in the gloom. Somehow you hear that in her voice and in the liturgy to which she brings such life. So I think we've given a full selection, a very varied diet, and varied diet is not really the theme for Pesach, I think it's fair to say, when many of us are on day 4, 5 or 6 of the cardboard snacks that are mandated for our people during these 8 days. A more varied diet is available here with Unholy. I think we've given people quite a nice little selection, a smorgasbord of offerings, which again is forbidden during these 8 days. Really.
Only in podcast form is it allowed. We hope you enjoy this selection, and we will be back next week with our regular episode.
See you then, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.